The book of Numbers. How often do you have quiet time in the book of Numbers? It just sounds appealing, doesn't it? What are you reading in your Bible? Numbers. All you math nerds in the room probably love Numbers. But who reads a book called Numbers? We're actually taking an overview of every book of the Bible right now. We started in Genesis. We're all the way up to the book of Numbers. And when we think about Numbers, we might think, why is it even called that? And the name of the book is very interesting. Now, the Hebrew name is what's really most interesting because there's something different. The first 5 books of the Bible are called the Pentateuch. They're written by Moses, but there's something different about Numbers in the way it is named. All the rest of these 5 books are named in Hebrew based on the very first phrase. Genesis is called in the beginning. That's the first phrase in the book of Genesis. The first phrase in the book of Numbers, however, is, and God spoke. But that's not the name of it in Hebrew. The name of it in Hebrew is in the wilderness. And that's very telling that they call it in the wilderness because we're going to learn why they spent so much time in the wilderness. Now, we get our English name Numbers from the Greek word, which means numbers. It's actually the word arithmoi, which is where we get our word arithmetic. When we think about the author and date, it was Moses who wrote it. He wrote the first 5 books of the Bible. There is internal evidence to support that. You have some references in your little handout that you got in your bulletin when you came in. And again, only those who don't want to believe Moses wrote it are the only ones that you have to work real hard to try to believe that Moses did not write the first 5 books of the Bible. As far as the date, this, like the other books of the Pentateuch, well, the last 4 anyway, are dated based on when we believe the Exodus took place. And the Exodus took place either in 1446 or 1260. And so Numbers, it looks like, was written near the end of their 40 years. So that would give us a date of 1406 or 1220, respectively. Now, the structure, I don't talk often about the structure of the book, but I think it's really interesting to see what's going on here. So let me just make a few comments. The first 9.5 chapters, we see them preparing for their journey. Basically, what they're doing is they're getting ready now to go into the promised land. They're going to conquer all of their enemies in the promised land. At least that is the plan. And so they're getting ready for that. So a head count is taken of all of the men 20 years old and older who are able to fight in battle. So they're getting a head count of their fighting force. And they get a head count of 603,550. Now, something that's really interesting, there are 2 censuses taken in the book of Numbers, one at the beginning, before they spend 40 years in the desert, and then one at the end afterwards. And their population actually decreased in the desert. They go down from 603,550 to 601,730. That's also telling. They did not flourish when they were in the wilderness because they kept rebelling against God, and God kept killing a bunch of them. And we're going to see how some of that happened. Now, when they're numbered, we see the numbering of 12 tribes. But there's something different that we start seeing that's played out throughout the Old Testament. Those 12 tribes are not the 12 sons of Israel, but they're actually 11 sons of Israel. But Joseph's sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, were each going to get an inheritance in the promised land. Well, what happened to that other son? Well, the other son is Levi. Now, here's something really interesting. It's so cool to see how consistent the Bible is from start to finish. Back in Genesis chapter 34, there's a terrible thing that happened to the sister of Simeon and Levi. See, all these boys didn't have the same mamas. So there's something really terrible that happened to her. And Simeon and Levi committed a horrible act of violence in order to avenge what happened to their sister. It was not a good thing that they did. So way later in Genesis chapter 49, when Israel is about to die and he's pronouncing the blessings on his son, Simeon and Levi don't get much of a blessing. He says, you guys are violent, and you're always going to be violent, and you're going to be scattered about all through the land. Well, sure enough, the Levites in particular were violent. After the golden calf incident, when the people made this image or had Aaron make this image to worship this golden calf, it was actually the Levites who took their swords and went through the camp and killed 3,000 people in one day. But the Levites were set aside to be the priestly tribe. And so the priestly tribe wasn't going to get an inheritance of land, but instead they would be scattered throughout the land. They would get their own cities, but they would be able to carry out the priestly duties throughout the land. Levi had 3 sons, and so the descendants of those 3 sons each had different priestly duties. The highest of those were the descendants of Kohath, the Kohathites. Moses and Aaron were descendants of the Kohathites, and these would be the guys that would be the high priests. And they were actually counted too, but not in the census. And we learned there were 22,000 males from birth up and 8,580 between the ages of 30 and 50. Now, why is it important to count between the ages of 30 and 50 for the Levites? Because those are the ages they would carry out their priestly duties. So I want you to know, I'm telling you all this so that you can recognize that even reading a book like Numbers lays a solid foundation for so much that goes on in the Bible. And if we skip over these parts, much of the Bible will be confusing to us because we don't have that knowledge. As we move through Numbers and the rest of chapter 10 through chapter 12, we see that they journey from Sinai, which nobody really knows exactly where Sinai is, but it's pretty well believed that Sinai is in the southern part of the Sinai Peninsula, and they travel up to the northern part of the wilderness on the south side of the Promised Land, thinking that they're about to take the Promised Land from there. Now, as they move up there, we see that this journey is marked by complaints and problems. But it gets even worse. In chapters 13 through 19, we see that they refuse to enter the Promised Land. And so God tells them they're going to get to spend 40 more years in the desert until every one of that generation, with the exception of 2 men, died off. Chapters 20 and 21, they journey from Kadesh to Moab. This is at the end of that 40 years. They move over to the east side of the Jordan River, to the land of the Moabites, where they are going to cross. They're getting ready to cross there. And I haven't been coughing like this until I started preaching. And in chapters 20 and 21, this time as they go over to Moab, this is where we see the Promised Land taken away from Moses and Aaron, and we see a wonderful little episode where God sent poisonous snakes to kill people. The rest of the book of Numbers is their time in Moab. They set up camp. This is where the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and half of the tribe of Manasseh asked for land on the east side of the Jordan. They're granted land on the east side of the Jordan on the condition that they cross over and help conquer everybody else's enemies before they come back and settle in. And then we see the second camp, the census. I want you to see just a couple of pictures up here. For one thing, you see in Numbers the arrangement of where everybody serves and where everybody's supposed to camp. These are the positions and duties of the Levites. So you see the Merarites, the Gershonites, the Kohathites, and then Moses and the priests. And then on the next picture, we see where everybody camps out around the tent of meeting. And then every time they move, everybody's supposed to take the same exact position in the direction of march, as the Levites are the ones who are carrying the tabernacle and the tent of meeting and all the things that go with that. In this next one, you can see actually a picture that depicts the likely journey from Mount Sinai up to Kadesh, which is seen as Kadesh Barnea here in the wilderness of Zin, which is, you can see, just south of the land of Canaan. And then in the next picture, when they send spies to check out the land, you can see where they move from Kadesh Barnea up through the Promised Land. You see the Mediterranean on the left, the Dead Sea on the right, then the Jordan River connects the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea, and you can see they went all the way up to the north part and back down. The spies actually spent 40 days taking care of their business. So, some of the background of Numbers, let's get into, look at that, God made a cup of water appear. Y'all, he did that in Numbers. He provided water. I think we need to sing some more, John. Whoever is the special person, who did that? Tom? It's not even noon yet and you're being nice. Oh, that feels good. I should cough more often. Let's talk about some significant themes and theology in the book of Numbers. Number one, God is faithful. God is faithful. This is something that we see. I want you to think about this census. One family moved into Egypt, 70 of them. One family, 70. One family comes out of Egypt, over 603,000 men. I want you to think about that. If there's 600,000 men, you know there's going to be 600,000 women. And if there's 600,000 men and 600,000 women, there's a bunch of kids running around. And we typically estimate that there were between 2 and 3 million people that God delivered out of slavery in Egypt. I want you to think of how faithful he is to fulfill his promises that he made to Abraham, to make his descendants as sands on the seashore, as stars in the heaven, so numerous that they wouldn't be counted. We don't have a head count of all of them. And not only that, he takes 2 to 3 million people into the desert and gives them enough water to drink and enough food to eat and provision to live in the desert for 40 years. God is faithful. Second significant theme is that disobedience is costly. This is something we surely learn in the book of Numbers. Now, in Numbers chapter 9, verse 23, after the census, after they're told how they're supposed to move camp, we read this. At the command of the Lord, they camped. And at the command of the Lord, they set out. They kept the charge of the Lord at the command of the Lord by Moses. That sounds awesome, doesn't it? And it lasted a minute. In chapter 11, they complained about all their misfortunes, so God sent fire to burn some of them to death. Well, that wasn't a good lesson for them, so they started complaining about their food. Oh man, y'all remember how the food was in Egypt? It was so good. We had cucumbers and we had fish. The food was so good. Moses goes to the Lord and said, Lord, how am I supposed to feed all these people? God says, I'm going to send them quail and a plague. So he fed them with quail and killed some of them with a plague. In chapter 12, Miriam and Aaron, Moses' brother and sister, they decide, sort of a ruse, they're going to complain about Moses marrying this Cushite woman. That really wasn't the issue as you see when you read it. But they start complaining about Moses. And who do you think you are, Moses? So God strikes Miriam with leprosy. What does Moses do? He prays for Miriam. And God heals her. In chapters 13 and 14, we see the story about the spies and the rebellion. We're going to come back and take a better look at chapters 13 and 14. In chapter 16, there are 3 guys named Korah, Dathan, and Abiram, who they're fed up with Moses. They don't like Moses' leadership. And by the way, who is this guy? Who does he think he is? So they come to Moses with 250 supporters. And they say, hey, who do you think you are? You're no better than we are. We can do everything you do. We don't need you telling us what to do. So the ground opened up and swallowed Korah, Dathan, Abiram, and their families and their possessions and closed up over them. And fire came from the Lord and burned up their 250 supporters. Well, now they're learning their lesson, right? No. Chapter 20, they get near Kadesh and they complain that they don't have any water. Now Moses has had it at this point. So Moses goes to the Lord and said, what am I supposed to do? Moses had provided water before out of a rock. He told Moses to take his staff before, and he says, you go strike the rock, and I'll bring water out of the rock. So Moses strikes the rock, water comes out of the rock. Well, this time, God says to Moses, go speak to the rock, and I'll bring water out of it. Well, Moses gets in front of the people and says, do I have to do everything? And he gets mad, and he takes his staff, and he strikes the rock twice. And water comes out, and God says, you have betrayed me. And because of that, neither you nor Aaron will go into the promised land. Now we look at that and go, man, that's kind of harsh, isn't it? Here's Moses, who's been God's man. He has been so obedient. But if you remember from last week, I talked about how the standard is higher for those in leadership, is it not? God gave specific instructions, and Moses did exactly what he wanted to do, and it cost him dearly. In chapter 21, we read that the people get impatient. Guess what? They don't like the food. So God sends poisonous snakes. And I know what you're thinking. Why did it have to be snakes? And then in chapter 25, they decide they're going to worship the pagan god Baal, so God sends a plague and kills 24,000 people. Now what happens every single time they have these issues? It starts with a discontentment, doesn't it? They're discontent. God has provided, and it's just not good enough for them. What God has given is not enough. Now I know what you're thinking. Mike, are you trying to say God would kill people today? Maybe. I don't know what God's going to do, but nevertheless, discontentment and complaining will destroy you. They just will. They will ruin your family. I wonder if some of you are married to a complainer, and your marriage is miserable. I wonder if some of you have a relationship of another kind with people who complain all the time, and it has destroyed the relationship. I wonder how many churches are destroyed because of discontentment and people who complain because they don't get their way. It's never any good. So instead of complaining, let us be thankful. Third theme we see here over and over is that rebellion against spiritual leadership is dangerous. Now, we pastors aren't supposed to talk about this, and I'm just going to tell you, I have no axe to grind. I don't think anybody's rebelling against my leadership as your pastor, so I don't want you to think, oh, what's Mike getting at? Nothing. What's Mike's agenda? He doesn't have one. But it's so glaringly obvious in the book of Numbers. Over and over, these people are complaining against Moses, and God takes it personally. Do you know that there was a recent study of evangelical pastors that revealed that 71% of pastors are burned out? 90% of pastors say that they're exhausted. By the way, I love what I do, y'all. I love it. 57% of pastors would leave the ministry if they had any other skills. 78%, listen to this, 78% have been forced out of their churches at least once. 63% at least twice. Now I want you to hear this very clearly. 1,500 American pastors leave the ministry altogether every month. At times, they need to. They've done something immoral. They've taught heresy. Something's gone bad. But so often, that's not the case. I went to a church, former church that I pastored, that had dismissed the previous 4 pastors. You know what they said? We just can't find the right guy. Their attendance had gone from 1,000 to under 200. And I got there and quickly found out what was up. There was a small group that was vicious. And the rest of the church just sat around going, well, we don't want to rock the boat. And it's a terrible thing. Churches like that will stand before God one day. If God calls someone and you reject that person for other than biblical reasons, God takes it personally. Now, fourth, God is faithful. Wait, didn't I say God is faithful already? Yeah, but I can't say it enough. Because what I was talking about a minute ago is how God provided for them, but I wanted to bring this up again after we have considered how rebellious and hard-headed and stiff-necked these people are. And what does God do? Well, he sends some consequences, and he keeps feeding them. And he keeps guiding them. And he keeps loving them. And he eventually takes them to the promised land. Because no matter how unfaithful we are, God is always faithful, for he cannot deny himself. Now, I want us to look at this one passage briefly, Numbers chapter 13. So if you have your Bibles, open them to Numbers chapter 13. By the way, if you don't own a Bible, or if you have one that is in a language that's hard for you to understand, if you'll come see me right out here, or stop at the welcome desk right out here, we will be happy to give you a brand new Bible, no strings attached. Just tell us you need one and you can have it. So in Numbers 13, 12 spies are sent into the promised land, one man from each of the 12 tribes. They're sent into the promised land, and they're told, go check out the land we're about to get. Go bring it, look at what's up, bring us back a report and tell us what the land is like. Tell us who you find there. Tell us the conditions and all those kinds of things so we'll be ready to go to war. So they go all through the land. They spend 40 days doing that. They come back out. They bring these big clusters of grapes and all these different kinds of produce. And here we find the report of the spies in chapter 13, verse 27. It says, and they told him, we came to the land to which you sent us. It flows with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. However, one of the most dangerous words God's people can utter. However, the people who dwell in the land are strong. The cities are fortified, very large. Besides, we saw the descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites dwell in the land of the Negev. The Hittites, the Jebusites, and the Amorites dwell in the hill country. And the Canaanites dwell by the sea and along the Jordan. Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, let us go up at once and occupy it. We are well able to overcome it. Then the men who had gone up with him said, we are not able to go up against the people, for they're stronger than we are. So they brought to the people of Israel a bad report of the land that they had spied out. Say, the land through which we have gone to spy it out is a land that devours its inhabitants. And all the people that we saw in it are of great height. There we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who come from the Nephilim. And we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them. Then all the congregation raised a loud cry, and the people wept that night, and all the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The whole congregation said to them, would that we had died in the land of Egypt, or would that we had died in this wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us into this land to fall by the sword? Our wives and our little ones will become prey. Would it not be better for us to go back to Egypt? And they said to one another, let us choose a leader and go back to Egypt. Joshua and Caleb, by the way, then tried to convince the people, no, God will give us the land. Let's trust him. Let's go. And they had none of it. Well, God wasn't happy, so he says to Moses, I'm just going to kill them all and start over with you. And of course, Moses prays for them. God relents, but here's what he says. He kills the 10 spies that gave the bad report. And he says they spent 40 days in the land. They're going to spend 40 years in the wilderness, and every single person of that generation is going to die in the wilderness. Not one of them will set foot into the promised land except for Joshua and Caleb. So what can we learn? I'll give you 4 lessons we can learn from this. Number 1, the safest place to be is in the center of God's will. The truth is, following God is risky. To follow God, they had to go live in the desert. To follow God, they had to go to a place that didn't have any food. They had to go to a place that didn't have any water, and they had to live by faith. To follow God requires risk. To follow God into the promised land meant they were going up against all odds. They were going up against bigger, stronger, more powerful armies, against fortified cities when they had none. It was risky, and it will be risky to follow God. You will find that following Jesus will actually take you into circumstances you'd rather not be. However, the greater risk is not following him. We went to seminary, and I found myself planting a church. And I was going to seminary full-time, and I was planting a church full-time. And I was working 3 part-time jobs, and had little kids running all around my house. And man, we were just barely, to say that we were barely making it's actually an overstatement of how good it was financially. And we were doing, you've heard of creative bill pay. We were doing that kind of thing, and it was hard, y'all. It was just hard. It was hard. I was between work and school, I was putting in around 110 hours a week, and just struggling. Planting this church, I didn't know what I was doing. The church wasn't growing. I was just discouraged. I went home one day and I said to Terry, I need you to get my pilot resume up to date. I'm tired of this. I can't do it anymore. We're just struggling, and I'm stressed, and flying's easy. I can fly and I can get a paycheck, insurance, just get my resume together. I'm going to go back to flying. And my godly wife said to me, okay, I'll do that, and I'll follow you anywhere. But I need you to do me a favor. I need you to look me in the eye and tell me that you have heard clearly from God that you're supposed to abandon your calling. I need you to tell me that even though God called you to seminary and called you to be a pastor, he's now revoked that call from you and is directing you to be a pilot again. Because I'll follow you anywhere. But I'm going to beg you, please do not take me and your children out of the will of God. For we won't survive that. And I said, dang it, woman. Following God was hard. But my wife knew that not following him would be disaster. What about you? Can you honestly say, I am right in the center of God's will? I'm doing everything I know to be doing right now. If not, this message is for you. Congratulations. Secondly, God does not lead us to do what we can do on our own. I want you to think about what the Israelites had seen. They had seen God part the sea for 2 to 3 million of them to walk through on dry land. They had seen God every day in a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. They had seen water come from a rock. They had seen manna appear on the ground. They had seen all these wonderful things. They had heard the voice of God thunder from the mountain with Moses. They had seen God move. But there's big people that live there. They'd seen this great and enormous God, but there's big people that live there. And by the way, do we not realize that's the whole point? God wasn't taking them to do something they could do on their own. God was taking them to do something they could not possibly do unless God intervened for them. There is no way these people could go conquer that land unless there was supernatural intervention. Church, I would say to you, if it's easy and we can afford it, God's probably not in it. I was in another church one time, and we were having a meeting, and the whole church really believed God was calling us to do some stuff, and we didn't have the money to do it, but we all really thought this was God's will. And in this meeting, we were in a committee meeting, this one guy just says, Mike, you can't find one place in the Bible where God has told people to do something that they couldn't have easily done it without his help. Poor guy. Got a lesson from Genesis to Revelation from me that day about how that's exactly what God calls us to do. And I am so impressed. One of the things I loved before I came to Central is I have heard what God has done through Central. I have heard how Central has stepped out on faith and how God has shown up and done some great things at Central. But you know what? We can't rest on that. The question is, what will we do going forward? Third lesson, looking backward is deadly. Oh, it was so great in Egypt. They were slaves. They were slaves in Egypt. And oh, it was so good back there. The fish and the cucumbers. Think about that for a minute. They're getting excited about cucumbers. That's the kind of stinking thinking they're having. I actually like cucumbers, but I don't dream of them. Oh, it was so good. It was so good. It's kind of like when I wanted to go back to flying, all I could remember is how easy it was. I wasn't thinking of being on call 24/7. I wasn't thinking of the last month I flew full time where I spent 28 days on the road and 15 nights in a hotel. I wasn't thinking about the insecurity that my children had because of my erratic schedule and the kind of aviation I was in and how it was really difficult. I forgot, we romanticize the past, don't we? Churches do this all the time. Oh, back in the day. Best pastor we ever had, man. Best pastor. I've had so many people here, it's funny, say, oh, Pastor Mike, the best pastor we ever had was. Best music guy we ever had was. The best this, the best that. Man, it was so great back in the day. Let me make just 3 comments about back in the day. Number 1, it's probably not quite as good as you remember it. Because we do romance. We romanticize the past. Number 2, you can't go back. How many of you have ever been able to turn back the clock? You cannot go back. And number 3, y'all, we have to look forward. God is a forward-looking, forward-thinking God. We have to look forward. The past is instructional for us in moving forward. And the last lesson we learn from this passage, when God speaks is God's timing. So God said, it's time to go to the promised land. They said, we can't do it. Those people are too big. God said, fine, you're going to spend 40 years in the wilderness. And they said, whoa, we will go. And Moses said, don't do it. Don't do it. But they did. First battle, they got thumped because God wasn't in it then. When God speaks is God's timing. Church, when God leads us to do something, we have to do it. We saw the coolest thing at church I once pastored. When I got there, I was looking at the community as a pastor, and I was thinking, what are some things missing in the community, areas the church isn't ministering, and I went to some of the leaders in the church, and I said, hey guys, let's talk about this and pray about this. I'm seeing where we could minister in these 4 areas in particular, and would y'all pray about that? And they prayed about it and said, yeah, we really see those as areas that God would have us minister. We're in the right location, we've got the right facility for that. And so we went to the church and we said, church, would you spend a week fasting and praying, just seeking the Lord's will about doing these things? And the church came back and unanimously said, yes, this is what we have to do. This is what the Lord has for us. So we didn't have any of the money to do it, so we raised hundreds of thousands of dollars. And we launched the first initiative, and it was so successful. We won so many people to Christ through doing this. We launched the second initiative, and it was in its infancy. And then the third one, we were ready to pull the trigger on it. We're sitting there ready to go. And by the way, this was a ministry that was actually going to generate a lot of its own support for the ministry. And we were ready to do it. We had cash reserves in the bank for 3 years of operating expenses. And the church said, whoa, what are we going to do in 3 years when that money's gone? What if it doesn't work? And we've spent all that money that we've designated to that, and in 3 years, what if God doesn't provide? We can't do it. Timing's not right, they said. The timing's not right. Church, will we be obedient to what God says to do when God says to do it? This is not just for peoples, this is for people, for individuals as well. Let me tell you just another story. When I went to seminary, we knew that the Lord was calling us to ministry. And you say, well, how did you know? I knew a lot of ways. I just had this deep growing conviction in my heart. I couldn't pray without that. Terry shared the conviction. She shared the calling. We knew this was the Lord's will. We had the church body affirming that. Just people coming up and saying, hey, you need to be a pastor. Just out of the blue. And so we're getting all this from folks, and we're praying. There was nothing unbiblical about becoming a pastor, and so we're looking at all that, and so I applied to Southwestern Seminary, and let me tell you something that happened all in 1 week. In 1 week, it started off, I got my acceptance letter from seminary. You've been accepted to the master's program. I said, oh, that's great, but it's not time to go yet. And so same thing that week, I get a call from a guy, just a connection with somebody I had. He said, hey, I'd like to offer you a job when you're out here. I love hiring seminary students. Work when you can, work as much as you want to. You take off, go to class, and I'll just work around your schedule, and I'd love to have you. And I said, oh, thank you very much. It's just not quite time yet. And somebody called and said, hey, we found a great place for you to live that's in your budget. And we said, oh, man, that's wonderful. You found us a place to live. When it's time, we'll let you know. And then that same week, I get a phone call from a guy in the church who says, Mike, my wife and I really love you, and Terry, we know that you're called to go to ministry. We see that in your lives, and we would like to pay 100% of your seminary expenses as long as it takes. We'll buy your books. We'll pay your tuition. We'll cover everything 100% the whole time you're there. And I said, thanks, Chris. That's really sweet. And when it's time, I'll take you up on that offer. And so then I sat down with one of the ministers on our staff, and he says, well, what's going on with you going to seminary? I said, well, I got my acceptance, I got a job, I got a place to live, and I got somebody to pay for it, but it's just not time. And he said, why isn't it time? I said, well, we need to save up a little money because, we got moving expenses. And we will. We're working on it. We're saving up the money. And he said, here's the thing. I'm going to have a check for you tomorrow for the amount of all these expenses. And I'd like for you to share with me what other excuses you're going to come up with to sit on your backside and stay out of God's will. And I said, none? And 2 weeks later, I was in seminary. Because when God speaks, it's God's timing. What is God calling you to do right now? You say, well, how do I know? You know if you'll just be honest. For a long time, God was calling me to ministry, and I'm going, well, maybe, I don't know, I'm not sure. I knew. What's he calling you to do? Well, how does he call me? First, through his word. Obedience to his word is primary. If you're living in rebellion against his word, don't ask him to give you some bigger assignment. If there's some area you're living in rebellion against God, fix it today. In fact, I know a lot of people won't read their Bibles every day because they don't like what it says. But he also does this through prayer as he brings conviction. He does it through other people. He does it through the circumstances in your life. And listen to this, Psalm 95. Do you know that Psalm 95 talks about Numbers 13 and 14? And in the New Testament, the book of Hebrews picks up Psalm 95, talking about Numbers 13 and 14. And over, you know what it says in Hebrews? Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts like you did in the wilderness. Don't be like those people in Numbers 13 and 14. If God is leading you to do something, do it and do it now. And there are some of you who have never stepped out to follow Jesus Christ. You have never made the decision to turn from your sins and follow him, and he's made the way for you. God's done everything necessary for you to be right with him. He sent his son to suffer in your place all the consequences of your sin for all eternity. He took all that on himself so that you don't have to. He was your substitute. Your sin, my sin, killed him. And then he rose from the grave, showing that he has victory over death, he has victory over life, and he even has victory over hell. And he says, if you'll just turn from your sins and embrace me by faith, you'll be right with God. You'll be saved. And some of you are probably thinking, I'm going to do that one day. No. Today, if you hear his voice, don't harden your hearts like these people. Don't do it. And this is our takeaway. It's really simple. Do what God wants you to do and do it now. Whatever it is. And I'm convinced sitting right there, you know what it is. You say, well, I don't know what this means 20 years down the road. It doesn't matter. You know what it is right now today that you're supposed to be doing. Just do it. Let's pray together.